All right, it's 8:35, so we'll get started. I think everyone should have joined by now. So first of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm James Spittal. Obviously, or maybe not so obviously to some of you, I'm the founder and CEO of a company in Australia called Web Marketing ROI. Like probably many of the speakers you've seen today, I'm running an experimentation agency. I founded that in 2011. We were one of sort of Australia's first pure experimentation and CRO agencies. And I guess somewhat uniquely, I've been an engineer and developer myself for about 25 years now. So I first kind of got started with development when I was about 7 years of age, back in the old HTML days. And I guess professionally, I've been focused on experimentation and marketing technology for about the last 9 years of Web Marketing ROI now. Back in 2014, I wrote a very simple, straightforward kind of server-side testing tool, which is kind of a proof of concept for clients. And I guess since then, I've been somewhat fascinated with this whole kind of client-side, server-side discussion. In terms of hands-on experience, I've been kind of in the trenches doing experimentation, both client-side and server-side, in a variety of different regions, Australia, New Zealand, UK, US, Hong Kong, for quite a few years for clients like Miele, Optus, American Museum of Natural History, RMIT, Latitude, Cathay Pacific, and so on. So yeah, really excited to take you guys through this content today. We've also got a lot to get through today, so I'm going to probably talk pretty fast, but I hope that's all right. Okay, so bit of a kind of a top level summary of what we're going to be talking about. I want to talk kind of initially about the industry perspective on this, and there isn't much of an industry perspective around server-side experimentation because honestly, it's still quite new. I think the industry is still evolving and still maturing in terms of, I suppose, our approach towards this and how we deliver this to clients. But I wanted to start there. Then we're going to talk a bit about where I think a lot of enterprises and clients get this wrong, both agency side and client side. So we're going to talk about our maturity model, a few different approaches to this. We're also going to talk about sort of the basics of what you need to know about client side, server side, how do they actually differ. And we'll also cover off on some examples around kind of challenges and some of the lessons learned that we've had over the years of working with this stuff kind of in the trenches. Then we'll have some time for a Q&A at the end. So please do save your questions until the end. We'll go through those in the last sort of 5 minutes. Okay, so first of all, the industry perspective. Well, I'm sure most of you have heard of Conversion XL, and that's obviously a blog that, you know, as CRO professionals, we probably all read a fair bit. If you haven't checked it out before, you probably should, in case you've been living under a rock. So Alex Burkett is one of the writers for Conversion XL, and there is a post there about server-side testing, and I quite like this one. So marketers of all stripes are obsessed with tools. The obsession has bred a comprehensive list of growth tools, SEO tools, general marketing tools, and obviously CRO is no different. However, no conversion optimization program has ever hinged on which tool you use. And there are important distinctions between tools, but one thing is, you know, we can look at as client side versus server side, but I guess Conversion XL's perspective is, which we kind of echo here, is that is, you know, whether you use client side or server side is probably not going to make or break your program. It's maybe more about the process, the organization, the velocity, the organizational KPIs around the program more so than the tooling. But nonetheless, the tech matters too. Also, Harvard Business Review, experimentation needs to be embraced across the entire company, and managers along with executives must have a mindset where they seek out others' opinions or ideas. Managers cannot think that they know everything when it comes to running their business. A culture of experimentation is centered around innovation. I think that's very important. So this is just a bit of comic relief, but this is Market Tunist. I don't know if you've seen this blog before, but they have a lot of comedy. And they say, and after the big data solves all of our problems, we're going to ride away in magic flying unicorns. So, you know, there's a perception out there that the tools will solve your problems, and there's a lot of buzz there, a lot of hype out there. Don't necessarily buy into it, but nonetheless, there are some kind of key takeaways here. So one of the things I really want everyone to take away from this is it's not just about the platform and not just about the tech. So we have this concept we call the 3 Ps of experimentation. And some of you might have seen this concept before. It's not necessarily unique to our approach. But the 3 Ps are quite simple, right? It's platform, people, and process. So in other words, platform or tech is only maybe 1/3 of the overall picture. You really need to get the people and the process right if you want to be able to have your experimentation program be successful. So we're only going to talk about platform today, but I want everyone to know and sort of note that that's only a very small part of the picture. Like many things in life, experimentation is discipline. So I've got here a picture of the Karate Kid, Mr. Miyagi, wax on, wax off, but it's very relevant, right? Because this is a discipline and it takes many, many, many hours and many, many years to master. The expectation is that like any discipline, if you want to get better at it, you have to spend a long time at it and you have to take an approach towards mastery. It's more like going to the gym, you know, so being successful in going to the gym is about turning up every day and trying to get better. It's not about, there is no final point, no final destination. Another way of saying this same concept, I guess, is the maturity model that we use. So there's many maturity models out there. This is ours, and it's sort of very Australian specific, I guess. But the takeaway here is that the tooling, the tech, is only maybe 1/8 of the overall picture of what you want to achieve here. You also need to think about structure, the methodology, the people, the knowledge, the activities, how frequently you're testing, the processes you're using, and they're as important as the tech, if not more important. So one of the concepts we've come up with and kind of come up with ourselves is this idea of the 50 experiment rule. So the 50 experiment rule is basically the idea that for every 50 experiments you run, you're going to be pretty lucky to come up with kind of a unicorn experiment. And we think of a unicorn experiment as an experiment that has kind of a 5% or greater lift to your overall revenue, right? The first thing to remember is that according to the stats out there, mostly only 1 in 10 tests tend to actually produce a statistically significant winner. But even then, those that win tend to only produce maybe a 1 to 3% lift. And that's not going to necessarily excite your clients very much or excite your company very much. So if you want to get a big win, you're generally going to have to do a lot of tests and a lot of experimentation to get that done. Okay, so let's talk about, first of all, what is client-side A/B testing? We've probably everyone here has used client-side testing before. And really, what is it? If you boil it down, it's really manipulating, in technical terms, and I'm an engineer, so I think of things in tech terms. It's about manipulating the document object model of the website via JavaScript calls, basically. So how does that work? Well, first of all, why do we do it? Well, one of the advantages, I suppose, of client-side testing is it's typically lower cost. It's kind of easy to get started. There's many client-side tools out there. It's particularly well suited to non-technical individuals, sort of WYSIWYG friendly, if you will. And it's kind of tends to be fast, better for marketing teams, less kind of product team centric. You know, you have this kind of classic flickering problem, which we might talk a little bit about later. And it can sometimes lead to latency on the page. So let's talk about the typical architecture of a testing tool, client side. So generally in a client side app, you've got something like you've got the browser, the user kind of visits the site, then the JavaScript snippet at the top of the site will generally load. That will bring in the JavaScript code, which might look something like this. In this case, this is actually modifying a headline and actually replacing it for the variation. The server request kind of handles the snippet third-party request. That brings back to the actual browser, and then the browser will actually then render the JavaScript, and then the experience is delivered, right? That's pretty basic. There still can be this concept of events for goal tracking, and you still might have some kind of snippet or data file, and maybe a CDN, but that's basically how it works. Pretty straightforward. Server side's a bit different. So I'm not sure how many of you are developers. I'm guessing probably, you know, the minority. Most marketers don't tend to be able to develop code. It's kind of a different skill set. But server-side testing is really about the idea of leveraging backend technologies to kind of process the test experience or process the bucketing logic, if you will, before the page is fully loaded. And if you've been around server-side tech for a while or been around the web for a while, you'll know that this method is has a number of advantages, which we'll talk about now. So, but there are some sort of disadvantages and differences too. It's not necessarily one's better than the other. It's really about which do you want to use for your situation and for your team and for your organizational structure. So some of the differences are it's a completely different way of deployment. You've got to deal with caching and CDNs in a completely different way. Most large businesses will tend to have some kind of CDN layer. It brings with it a lot of anonymity. So there's kind of an element of stealth where the person on the website might not even know that you're running an experiment on them or that you're testing on them, so to speak, whereas it's very different client side. It sort of eliminates this flickering problem almost altogether because of the way that server side works. Tends to bring with it a lot of precision and accuracy. But it also brings a lot of challenges too, like, well, how do we implement this into our software development lifecycle? How do we handle instrumentation? How do we make sure that our CDN doesn't cache the wrong thing? How do we handle our third-party integrations? And so on. So again, let's talk about server-side architecture as distinct from client-side architecture. So similar kind of thing, user visits to add the app, we still have the experience delivered, but the way that we actually process events and the way that we actually handle the data file and handle events tend to be dramatically different. And also we tend to have, instead of writing our experiments in JavaScript, we write our experiments in maybe Java or Node.js or Python or Ruby or PHP. And then we actually, so in other words, we code it in the language that's native generally to the web app. And that, if you've got a dev team or a product team, might make things dramatically easy, might actually make your life much, much simpler. One of the things to remember is that, generally in a team, you might have a product team and maybe a marketing team. And so when you're doing this, what you find is that it's sort of, experimentation becomes no longer just this thing that's siloed kind of to the marketing team, and then often the product team might actually push against, but it tends to become more of a less siloed initiative where you might actually be relying more heavily on your product team, more heavily on your internal developers. And you might actually find that can have a big effect on your velocity for the program. And it can also slow things down. It really depends how it's managed, right? Sometimes it's a bit of a weird scenario in client side where you have an entire code base that's maybe written in PHP or something like that, and then you're kind of hacking on all these JavaScript client-side tests. Well, it sort of raises the question, wait a minute, wouldn't it be better to kind of attach all of these experiments, all of these features we're building into kind of native PHP code rather than sort of rewriting everything in JavaScript? So there can be a lot of benefits, and it can really minimize the amount of coding you have to do. It can also dramatically increase the amount of coding you're doing, bringing a plethora of new challenges that don't really exist right now. So let's go over some of the key differences. Well, first of all, there's a whole number of differences when it comes to the actual setup and the editing and the caching. So with the setup, I guess client side's fairly easy. You're just putting generally a line of JavaScript in the sort of the top bit of the header before everything else loads, sort of pre-DOM ready. And with server side, it tends to be a bit more custom, right? You've got to implement the SDK, instantiate the objects, activate the experiments. And there's sort of things to think about there we'll talk about. The editing in client side is like, oh, WYSIWYG. And every marketer loves this idea generally of WYSIWYG. The reality, of course, is that if you're doing a high quality, high velocity client-side experimentation program, you shouldn't be using the WYSIWYG editor at all. You should really be building out your experiments in JavaScript, because that's the best way to do it, basically. Whereas in server side, you don't have really the option of relying, or you don't tend to rely on JavaScript as much. You're building it in your kind of native code, which in an SDK, which might be PHP or Node or Python or any of those. With caching, you kind of don't have client side, you kind of don't have this problem with the CDN at all. Because of the way that snippets and third-party JavaScript libraries tend to work, the CDN will basically serve everything, and then essentially the layer of JavaScript, the JavaScript snippet, will actually render everything sort of after the CDN's done. With the server side, you kind of need to think about how you're going to handle your CDN architecture, and that can be a real showstopper for some large businesses. We've had situations where clients have had very, very complicated architectures where they've got numbers of reverse proxies, and they've got different caching going on all around the world. And sort of making sure that your server side doesn't conflict with that can actually be quite challenging. The turnaround for a client side is pretty quick, whereas with server side, you need a release, you need a deployment, right? And a lot of businesses that are running this agile philosophy these days might be doing releases, say, in 2-week blocks, for instance. So you might deliver your A/B test server side into the code base on like a Monday in week 1, and you might have to wait sort of 2 weeks before it gets released and put into production so that you can actually see the experiment and start bucketing users and start getting data back on that. And that can be quite annoying sometimes. That can actually slow things down quite a bit. In terms of like accessibility, I guess, client side is really sort of designed for everyone. It's made for marketers and product teams. With server side, it's really developer centric. If you're not able to write code quite efficiently, you shouldn't be really building experiments in the server-side program. That said, you don't want to only involve your developers in this program or your product engineers or product managers in this program. If you're doing this server-side, you still need, in my experience, people with an experimentation background and people with that ability to ideate and come up with good test ideas. Otherwise, the whole thing's going to fall flat. So you're always going to need that strong experimentation leadership for this to work, irrespective of what tooling you use. In terms of some of the other criteria, variations. So with client side, you've got a fairly limited variation. It's sort of front end only, so you can't necessarily call on back end variables or back end functions. So if you're doing some advanced stuff with sorting or maps or something of that nature, or pricing or databases, you don't really have much flexibility there. Server-side kind of makes it a bit easier. You can kind of piggyback off some of your existing code in the back end and bring that into your experiment, which is quite interesting. This is really good if you've got maybe a mobile app or some kind of advanced algorithm behind your actual web application. And then you can start to test the actual mechanisms by which that algorithm works and see which works the best. In terms of performance, you kind of have this whole synchronous and asynchronous kind of flickering kind of challenge that comes up frequently with client side. With server side, you kind of get optimal performance, right? Like you find that the web application loads very fast. You find that by the nature of server-side programming, it tends to be all very, very quick, and it all happens kind of before you can even see it. So there's no like visual loading or flickering effect. It's virtually instant or invisible to the user. In terms of security, there's no doubt that server-side is much better because you find with client-side, if you're sneaky and you know what you're doing, you can probe into the client-side library. You can find out the names of experiments. You can find out how many experiments are being run. That's not really possible with server-side. It's almost invisible because it tends to happen server-side unless you're watching the DOM very closely and watching HTML very closely and kind of reverse engineering it. It's almost impossible to know what's even going on. With client-side, it tends to be somewhat channel specific, whereas server-side tends to be channel agnostic. And in terms of extensibility, I guess you could say client-side is kind of designed for simplicity, and server-side may be a bit more flexible, perhaps you could say. According to some of the vendors, I guess one of the promises of experimentation on the server side is that it kind of gives you this idea of experimenting everywhere, which definitely was not as possible with client side as it was with server side. In particular, mobile apps. If you're doing any kind of testing on any kind of mobile app, iOS or Android, you have to use the server side. You haven't really got a choice. All app testing is really server side. Furthermore, if you want to do, I suppose, this idea of experimenting more broadly through your entire stack, whether it be like over the top or email or push or IoT, you can't really do that client side because those technologies are not really built for client side. You have to do it server side. So let's go over some examples. Some of the common use cases that make a lot of sense for server side are things like search algorithms, sorting algorithms, major redesigns, price changes, feature rollouts, back-end changes. These things are not very easy to do client side. So some real examples. Back in 2014, we had this client who was using something called TrialPay. I don't know if any of you have heard of TrialPay, but it's a payment processor. And essentially you can do something like do an activity and it gives you something for free. So it gives you like almost like something of equivalent value to about $10 or so. And this client had a problem because we were wanting to do this experiment and it was a server-side, well, it wasn't really server-side, but it was like a site-wide test. The whole site was redesigned. It was the whole new site that we designed versus the old site with the same kind of IA. And we wanted to basically have a full site-wide test and be able to track conversions on this particular payment processor, in addition to PayPal. We found that there was no way, there was no thank you page. So we didn't really have a choice. We had to use the server-side technology, and we actually wrote one for this purpose back in 2014. It's quite an interesting experiment. In the end, I think we got about 16% lift site-wide, but it wouldn't have been possible to even know or do that client-side because flickering by itself would have completely destroyed the results of that test. So let's talk about some of the challenges. Well, when you're doing server-side, there's a whole plethora of challenges that come up that don't really exist in the client-side world. So some of those challenges include things like working with data files, which you don't really have to worry about very much. SDK instantiation of the actual data object. User ID management, so how are we going to refer to users? Server-side event tracking. So where in the code base are we going to fire these events? Bot filtering, a whole bunch of others. So this is an example in Python of how to actually instantiate a data file and handle that. I won't go through this in detail because I know most of you are probably not developers, but suffice to say that basically we implement the SDK, set the endpoint, and then ping the data file, basically. This is another testing tool, so different testing tool. And this is an example in PHP, but this is how you might instrument or implement the SDK, call the SDK, return the function, and then trigger from there. This is an example of handling user ID storage in PHP, again, server side. The key thing to remember here is we're basically looking, like we've got to come up with a public key, or sorry, a primary key for the user. There's a number of different approaches towards identifying users, in particular, known users versus unknown users, and this gets a bit tricky. Basically, with known users, we can refer to them correctly. With unknown users, we have to kind of have an alternative primary key to refer to them. Here's an example. So the key difference here is basically we have this function, and then we want to call the function to know we contacted sales, so we sort of trigger it down here. This is an example from our testing tool back in 2014, where you fire a track conversion, fairly typical in terms of the testing tools out there. If you wanted to filter bots, that's another problem that often comes up. Like, how do you filter robots? Well, in this case, we've got a function where we basically look for different robot names and then filter them out accordingly. So some of the lessons learned, and then we'll wrap up for the Q&A. So one of the challenges that comes up a lot is doubling or tripling event calls. So we had this situation from a number of years ago where we had this client who basically had all of their events sitting in Segment already, and essentially they didn't want to double up on all their events, right? Like they didn't want to fire track event again for every event that was already sitting in Segment. And there was no integration that kind of worked out the box for that testing tool and Segment back at that time. So in order to solve that problem, they had to come up with an event abstraction layer, which turned out to be a lot of extra work and a lot of extra time. And it was a bit of a bugbear for the client. Audiences can be a bit tricky. So you need to make sure that the variable is accessible prior to experiment activation. Otherwise, you've got challenges. And I guess the last kind of lessons learned, or lessons, sort of takeaways for us of doing this for the last couple of years is really around, first of all, you want to get everyone involved. This is very developer centric. So involve the developers early, maybe start a Confluence or a wiki. Devs tend to like that. You want to partner with the appropriate agency if you can. Doing this with the internal skills only tends to be quite hard. And the tooling is only a small part of the overall picture. You still need the right program, you still need the right buy-in, you still need to make sure you're measuring your KPIs very closely, you still need to be picking the right tests. There is no silver bullet in this. The tech is not going to solve your problems. Just because you went for server-side rather than client-side is not going to mean that your program is successful. And my advice too is you definitely want to incentivize product managers to, I suppose, have experimentation-based KPIs if you can. So things like velocity, win rate, throughput. You want to make sure that they are actually KPI to the product managers who are actually managing the program, if you will. And we've got a couple minutes for Q&A, so we'll move over to Q&A. Just pull up the list of any questions. Feel free to submit your questions in the chat box, and I'll grab a couple, and then we might go through the rest, depending on how we go for time. That's my chat box comes up. Do we have any questions? Don't think there's actually any questions come through yet. Here we go. So this question from Stu. You had 7 bots in that list based on that user agent. Have you developed this further to exclude more? I've written my own, but find bot traffic skews the data despite dozens of user agent exceptions. Great question. That was a very, very quick and dirty one for the testing tool we wrote many, many years ago. And we had a bit of time pressure in actually getting that out the door. So when we were writing that particular list of user agent filtering, we did it knowing very well that we were missing, things like Baidu Spider and all this kind of stuff too. And there's probably a whole list of different user agents we hadn't even considered. There is an official list from the IAG, the Internet Advertising something or other, or IAB. That's the same list that Optimizer uses in their full stack tool. And I think some of the other vendors might use something similar. So that's a good one to look at if you're trying to come up with solutions. But bot filtering is a constant problem. Many bots may not even reveal who they are. you know, yeah, there might actually be stealth about it, right? Next question is from Carl. Google have announced it tends to penalize sites for cumulative layout shift. Do you think client side will be impacted by this and more companies move to server side as a result? There's definitely, if you pay close attention to Google Search Console, you'll notice that you know, having too many DOM changes is definitely likely to be problematic when it comes to, and increasingly problematic when it comes to search engine ranking and things like that. This is very different from what Matt Cutt said many, many years ago when he was like, JavaScript A/B testing tools are perfectly fine. So I think there is a trend where excessive DOM manipulation is starting to have a detrimental effect on your site. That said, server-side sort of has the same problem, right? If you don't filter out your bots correctly, you can actually get heavily penalized for cloaking, because that's basically what cloaking is. Cloaking is the bot comes to your website and then you show something different. So the issue of SEO being a problem or affecting A/B testing has almost come full circle, where it's like it was sort of solved, it was not an issue, but now it's sort of becoming an issue again, I think. Definitely something to consider. My understanding server-side is as long as you filter the bots correctly and don't accidentally miss any bots, you should be fine as far as cloaking, but getting official answers about that is difficult. Any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, I think that's probably all the questions. Thank you very much for your time. Hope that was enjoyable. It was a lot to get through, obviously, in 25 minutes, but I highly encourage you all to give server-side testing a try. And of course, we're called Web Marketing ROI, and we're happy to walk anyone through further demos or questions about server-side if it comes up, and share some of our lessons learned. Thanks for your time.